to production. Documentary V1.0 vertical bar June 12th, 2026. Vertical bar 1,503 words. Vertical bar approximate light in 12 minutes at 130150. Bupi me. Where is a question that most people carry quietly for a long time before they say it out loud. It isn't the polished theological question. It isn't the version you would ask in a Bible study. It's the one that arrives at 2 in the morning when nothing has worked out the way it was supposed to. When the prayer you prayed with everything you had didn't get the answer you needed, when the door closed and then another one closed, and you have been standing in a hallway you didn't choose longer than makes any sense. The question is this: what is God doing in my life? Not in general, not theologically, specifically, here, in this chapter, in this year, this particular accumulation of loss and silence and doors that won't open. Most of us were handed a version of faith that worked in ordinary time. It was clean and navigable. You prayed and things happened. You followed and paths opened. There was a legible relationship between effort and outcome, between faithfulness and direction. And then something changed. Not your belief, you still believed, not your practice. You were still doing the same things, but the story stopped making sense. The chapter you were in had no visible purpose. And the silence that followed your prayers was not peaceful silence. It was the silence of a room where you are not sure anyone is listening. If that is where you are or where you have been, I want to show you something. Not a promise, not a formula, evidence. The first piece of evidence is a man named Joseph. He was his father's favorite, which was a dangerous thing to be. He had dreams, vivid, specific dreams about a future in which he mattered, in which his family would bow before him, in which the life inside him would become something large. He told people about the dreams. This was a mistake. Nope, his brothers sold him into slavery at 17. That is the chapter most people don't linger on long enough. 17 years old, the dream still fresh. Sold by the people who were supposed to love him to strangers into a country where no one knew his name, then falsely accused, then imprisoned, then forgotten for years. The text is ruthless about this. The chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot him, forgotten, in a pit, in a prison, with dreams he could not explain anymore. And then, not quickly, not conveniently, Pharaoh had a dream that no one could interpret, and a man who had been forgotten suddenly remembered a prisoner who had once spoken about dreams. And Joseph was called out of the pit and placed over the most powerful empire in the known world. And from that position, he saved his family, the same family that had sold him from a famine that would have destroyed them. He told his brothers later with a specificity that is still striking, "You intended it for harm. God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done. Not God made the best of a bad situation. God intended. The pit was not an accident he survived. It was a corridor he had to walk." The second piece of evidence is a young woman named Esther. She was an orphan living in a foreign country under an assumed identity, hidden, displaced, not where she was supposed to be, with no clear reason for the particular shape of her life. Her cousin Mordecai had raised her. She was Jewish in a Persian court, a fact she was instructed to conceal, a fact that would have gotten her killed. And then the king chose her. And then a man named Haman rose to power and issued a decree to destroy the Jewish people. And Mordecai came to Esther and said something she could not have understood when she was being raised in displacement, when she was hiding her identity, when she was waiting in a palace with no obvious purpose. Who knows if you were not placed here for such a time as this? For such a time as this, the orphan's displacement was not an accident. The hidden identity was not incidental. The years of waiting in a place that made no sense were not wasted. They were positioning. The specific life she had, including the parts that had no explanation, was the exact preparation for the exact moment she was needed. She could not have known that from inside the confusion. She could only know it from the other side. David was anointed king at 15. Then he went home to tend sheep. He killed Goliath. Then Saul tried to kill him. He spent years in caves, hiding, hunted, sleeping in places where kings should not sleep, leading a band of men who had nowhere else to go. The man who had been told by the prophet Samuel that he was chosen, that God had seen something in him no one else could see, that man spent the best years of his young life running. The Psalms he wrote in the caves are still the most honest prayers in the Bible. My God, why have you forsaken me? How long, O Lord? Will you forget me forever? The man after God's own heart wrote those words in a cave. He was not pretending the cave was fine. He was not performing faith he didn't feel. He was asking the same question you are asking. And the fact that he was asking it from inside what would become the defining preparation for his reign, a reign that would shape an entire nation, does not make the cave less dark. It makes it mean something. Paul wrote half the New Testament in chains. Before that, he had been the one doing the persecuting, hunting Christians, watching Stephen be stoned, breathing threats and murder against the early church.
Mm.
The man God chose to carry the gospel to the Gentile world had blood on his hands. His conversion was violent and disorienting. His early years as a follower of Jesus were marked by rejection from the very people he was now trying to join, and continued threats from the world he had left. He was beaten, shipwrecked, imprisoned, left for dead. He wrote from prison to churches he could not visit, about a freedom he could not physically experience, with a joy that has confused readers for 2,000 years. I've learned, in whatever state I am, to be content. Learned, not given. Not arrived with, learned through the specific curriculum of a life that looked from the outside like waste. The chains were not a footnote to his purpose, they were the place the purpose was completed. And then there is the tomb. 3 days where everyone who had believed in Jesus sat with the wreckage of what they had thought was the story. The disciples who had left everything, the women who had followed from Galilee, the people who had been healed, who had heard the teaching, who had said, "This is the one," all of them on the wrong side of a sealed stone. 3 days where the story looked finished, where everything they had believed was, by every visible measure, wrong. And then the stone was moved. Here is what these 5 stories have in common. Not the happy endings, though the endings are remarkable. What they share before the ending. Joseph didn't know what the pit was for. Esther didn't know what the hiding was for. David didn't know what the caves were for. Paul didn't know what the chains were for. And the disciples, those 3 days, did not know what the tomb was for. Every single one of them was inside a chapter that, read alone, is only suffering. The chapter only makes sense from the other side, which means you cannot judge the meaning of the chapter you are currently in. You are inside it. The story is not finished. The chapter you are in has a function that the chapter itself does not reveal. I am not telling you the hard thing you are in will become something beautiful. I cannot promise that timeline. I cannot promise the shape of what comes next, but I can show you a pattern, repeated, across every life that God ever used for something lasting. The preparation always precedes the purpose. The formation always comes before the function. And the preparation is always invisible to the person inside it. Joseph could not see it in the pit. Esther could not see it in the palace. David could not see it in the cave. Paul could not see it in the chains. The disciples could not see it at the tomb. What God is doing in your life right now, you may not be able to see it yet. That is not evidence that nothing is happening. It is the condition that has always accompanied the preparation. The story is not over. And the chapter you are in, as dark and as long as it has been, is not the last one.